All right, thank you everyone for making the time. We're going to go ahead and start our Finance and Appropriations Committee. If the treasurer could call the roll.
Mr. Peretti.
Here.
Mr. Brown.
Here.
Ms. Zaranen. She's running late. She emailed me. Ms. Hudson.
Here.
Mr. Jordan.
Here.
Mr. Miller. And Mr. Stewart. Do you have a quorum?
Thank you, sir. All right, real quick, very important meeting today. I appreciate everyone's flexibility as we were sort of had a moving target on when to deliver this based on contract negotiations and different things like that. Wanted to make sure that we put out a forecast that was reflective of all that. So in our agenda today, you'll see that we have our minutes, our monthly financials for September, and then we'll dive right into the 5-year forecast and any other comments at the end. So if we can take a look at the minutes real quick, we can get those approved. All right. I second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. All right, minutes are done. So now I'm going to hand it over to the treasurer to begin our monthly financial report.
Okay. I believe you should have in your packet a brief summary of the handouts. It begins like this. It would have been the last thing, well, maybe not the last thing you were handed, but you should have, anyway, the handouts for this presentation. This is for the month ending September. Once again, as with last month, the revenues are running ahead of plan by about 6%. It's actually right around a $20 million favorable variance year to date. On the expenditure side, we're running about 4%. You don't have this?
No.
Well, that's my bad. If you would like the slides, I will.
I mean, if we have the management discussion,
We can do
that
it.
flows
It's pretty
on
much
with
in
it.
there. And
Yeah, we can do it.
And I can put this out on the website as well, but it's just a recap of the MD&A as well. The expenditures run about 4% or $7 million under plan year to date. If we look at the revenue detail, been no changes in the property tax variance. As I said before, since this is the first fiscal year with the full collection, there can be some timing issues with the plan, but we'll know more in the spring as to whether or not that variance there of about 12 million holds to be true. But it could work itself out in the first half collections in the spring. State aid, the variance this month, both dollar amount and percentages, is pretty much unchanged from last month. We did just receive info on the October number 1 payment, so we made a comparison to the calculated and capped amount. And the capped amount with the new information in it so far for October, we're within about 500,000 of what our estimate is on over $340 million. So that's pretty much spot on. So we'll won't monitor that month to month, but we're pretty much right on target. The property tax allocation, the timing this month, it came in, matched with the plan. A little bit over plan that you see there will likely be worked out because the plan calls for about $3.3 million in the next few months to be received. And again, that was based upon some historical behavior, but that typically comes in a lump sum, but we had it spread over a couple of months. So you'll see this month and next month that'll probably work itself out, so we'll be on plan there. Other revenues, that is the same variance that carried forward this month. We don't expect much activity in this line, minimal. I mean, we're talking about $1 or $2 million a month for the balance of the year, but if you look in the MD&A, you'll see the plan calls for about a $2 to $3 million payment in June, and that's for indirect costs relative to special education. That comes in late in the year. So any large variance, of course this line item isn't that big to begin with, but any large variance we wouldn't see it till the end of the year probably. Other financing sources under plan for the month, dropping that variance to just $795,000 from $2.5 million last month. Again, a timing issue just working itself out. So overall revenues above target or above plan, and we understand those variances and don't think that there's anything monumental yet that would affect us long term. On the expenditure side, overall again, $7 million under plan, 4%. We look at personnel, We did in the plan adjust it for what's in the forecast, and the forecast does include salary and wage adjustments, so that's been adjusted in the plan. So if you look back on the previous couple of reports, the plan will look a little bit different. But that being said, personnel is running about 5% under plan at 6.4 million. One of the things that's happening in the beginning of this year is obviously the implementation of negotiated salary increases, which aren't completed yet. We will begin to make those payments under the new plan here soon. In one case, we have to wait for the agreement to be approved. There will be some retro pay, I'm sure. So I figure by December, we should have a better picture of where we are year to date. But it's good that we're running behind plan in theory at this point. So those are some of the issues that can perhaps catch us up and get us closer to plan come the end of December. Purchase services and the charter school line, the dollar variance and percent variance, again, same as last month, they're just running right to plan. Supplies and materials, this actually jumped to 1.9 million under plan. You'll see in the management discussion analysis that we look at some of the significant contributors to that. And here, I think there was a question about what's included in supplies and materials. So in the discussion, you'll see all those object codes that are in there that'll tell you general supplies, office supplies, software, textbooks, fuel, things like that.
The beginning of the year?
Pardon me?
Is it because, let me jump in on that one. So we are.
You've got three major contributors, and
Yeah.
Scott can speak. He's been emailing the budget managers about those three lines. Fuel, you don't really worry about.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
fully encumbered. So that's, we want to come in under budget on that.
That's
okay?
that's a plus.
Yeah, that's a plus. The other two, Scott can speak to.
And I'll jump with the fuel one, as you mentioned that one. The three items that are here, obviously the bus fuel piece, software materials, and supplemental textbooks. Because what we want to do is, like when you see the equipment, that we're over where we thought we would be at this time, but we're capped because we have the internal controls in place with the budget amounts that they can't spend more than what they have. So that's good. It's looking at the opposite end of this, that making sure that we haven't changed what they wanted to do, or we're underspending a significant amount. The bus fuel, the piece here that we got some information back is we were able to consolidate some of our routes, so we have fewer buses on the road, so that's a good thing. So the bus fuel piece is running low. Software materials, I'm trying to get this one here, pull this up here real quick. There's some information, it's just a timing issue, they just haven't put in the purchase orders for those. A significant amount of that, just about $500,000 of that, is in transportation for some of the products that we use. They just haven't been paid yet.
Would we,
So we're
would
still
we
planning.
see the same trend last year around the same time?
That I don't know, we can go back and look at that. I don't know what it was off the top of my head at this time last year. But I know that the pieces that are there, they've not changed anything in terms of what their plans are. They just haven't paid it yet. The supplemental textbook piece, because this is one that surprised me a little bit, because I thought, well, beginning of the school year, why don't we have these in hand? You know, we're coming up towards the end of the first quarter. Where are we with this? So the information on here is it's a timing issue. They're waiting to get some data back. They're still planning to purchase literacy resources for the high school. Once we receive the report card and map data, then they're going to make adjustments to the original plan so that they can expend those dollars. So they're waiting on information back from the report card to determine what exactly they need in terms of supplemental materials.
Very good, thank you.
Scott, did you say that the fuel to operate, you have fewer buses on the road? That's a piece of it?
That they've consolidated some of the routes. So
Gotcha.
yes.
Okay. So you get the benefit of consolidated routes and lower prices are probably banging you both ways. Got it.
Both good things to us.
Absolutely.
On capital outlay, no significant change from last month. As I said, that's kind of a residual of some orders coming over from last year being expended but didn't show up in the plan. Debt service and other objects, no significant changes from last month. You'll see on other financing uses, the next to the last line, that variance has dropped to just 274,000. Last month it was higher, and it was a timing issue, so as we predicted, it worked itself out. Overall, again, 4% under plan, about $7.2 million. So all in all, we're keeping track, we're keeping an eye on things, but we don't see anything alarming here as of yet. So that's it for September, and that concludes that part of the report.
Any other questions? All right, this report will go up to the board. Thank you. Now for the fun.
Now I just have
Fun,
to find
five-year forecast.
my 5-year forecast.
A lot of fun.
Paul? Is it on the desktop?
No, you have to go into yours. I just got the one file.
Oh, okay.
If you just want to change your,
Okay.
to yours and just get it that way.
Right.
Does that work?
Yeah, I can get that way. Bear with me for a second.
Good start. Went over the financial, about supplies and stuff like appropriating and things like that. Conversation. Everything's on the table, luckily, and then we're getting ready to dive into forecast presentation.
I emailed Stan and I was running a little behind.
That's okay. It's been a moving target all month. So I just appreciate you being flexible as well. It means a lot to me. Oh, thank you.
We've got Matt Elementary. Mr. Chairman,
Yeah?
I think it's, since we've got a minute, I think it might be good to remind everyone we didn't have a presentation of the 5-year forecast at our most recent board meeting because it wasn't ready for reasons you've already elaborated upon.
Yeah.
But the treasurer did send it out to all board members and did encourage all of them to attend this meeting so they would have a first go at it
Good.
prior to seeing it at the next board meeting when we're required to vote on it.
Absolutely.
So-
And if any board members have any questions, they can contact myself, yourself, and Stan, and if they need any extra attention.
Yeah, so
Make
thank
sure
you,
they have it.
Mr. Chairman, and thanks also to the treasurer for doing that.
My version of it was quick. Yeah. Technical.
That's all right.
Sometimes I think we're protecting Fort Knox here.
You have to anymore.
I know it's little numbers.
Yes.
All right. Now, you should have,
It's underneath.
what did I do with mine?
Nope.
Nope, not that one. What did I do with mine? Yeah, that should be it.
Okay.
This is, so I'll begin with this, 5-year forecast. This is the binder clip document. This is the first year that we've, I've got it right over here, thanks. We brought this in-house totally. So I put everybody's names, all the guilty parties are on the front here. Me, Mike, Scott, and we even got Eric Roush involved in pieces and parts of this to help write portions of the intro, as well as put another set of eyes that isn't quite the data geek that the three of us are. So hopefully we're real pleased with the document we've put together. You'll see in here there's a page for each line with a brief but complete description of what goes into each line and what our assumptions are. I've tried to include with each line, or have included with each line, a little pie chart that gives you an idea of its relative contribution to either revenue or expenditures. So I would say that as you look through this document, if these pie charts for each line are blue and black, the blue represents that particular line that we're speaking about on that page. The black is everything else. So the more blue you see, the more relevance it is to having an overall large impact on revenues and expenditures. If you cannot see the blue line, that doesn't mean that it's a mistake. It means it's so small that it pales by comparison to all the other items in revenue or expenditure. So it might help you focus your time and attention and going through the forecast. What I want to do in discussing the forecast is to take you, I should have used my back to the future icon, but roll the clock back to December of 16 and remind you of some major assumptions that we made at that point in time, which were part of the levy planning back in June of 2016. And in December of 16, we did an update to the October 16 forecast to reflect the passage of that levy. And there are some major assumptions in there that have a significant impact. They are the drivers of the forecast at a very macro level. The first assumption that we made back then was that the 5.58 mil levy would pass, which was a pretty safe assumption since we were in December and it in fact passed. Those are the kind of assumptions we like to make, based upon things that have already happened. But
That's called a lob.
yeah, there you go. And that levy included the additional personnel that Dr. Good spoke to and was part of the levy plan. The second major assumption was about state revenue. And we, at that point in time, remained with the assumption that the cap, which will be on throughout the life of the forecast, would increase as it had in the previous biennium at 7.5% each year. So it compounds itself over the life of the forecast. On the expenditure side, the major driver there, as you'll see as you read the forecast, is personnel costs. And at that point, I know I mentioned it numerous times that we included base increases that were currently negotiated. Those negotiated agreements, it would have expired in August of this year, at the end of, just past the end of fiscal 17. And we did not include any assumption about increases into the later years. We did include steps, though, all the way through the forecast. So with those three major assumptions, we get a cash balance picture that looked like this. Now, this has fiscal 17 through 22. At that point in time, our forecast was just fiscal 17 through 21. That was the 5-year period. And as you can see, 21 is essentially zero. Back when we did levy planning, that was our target. It was to plan the levy, plan the expenditures, look at revenues, such that fiscal 21 would be substantially right around zero, plus or minus. Given some of the various scenarios we ran through, sometimes it was a couple million positive, might have been a couple million negative, but when you're talking about an $850 million budget, that's substantially zero. So that's where we were.
And just to add to that, the state was in, financial health of the state was coming back pretty, is where they expected it to be. It wasn't until the later months they started seeing the income tax revenues deteriorating well past our planning and well past the approval of the levy. And due to, we would call it the Pareto model of keeping the cap of what we know it as, you know, Mr. Roush and I have this conversation a lot about, you know, assuming what the state's going to do. And I don't think it's an assumption of being conservative or being liberal with the way that we look into the future. it's such an unknown piece that it could just wildly change. And to me, is why we named it after me, which is going to be the detriment of me at one point. It feels like the safest way to go with the only unknown. So, and that's sort of where we were. And it wasn't called that then. This is a fairly newer development.
Yeah, we coined that in numerous budget meetings. So this is what the cash balance looked like over time at December of 16. So now fast forwarding, if you will, to what has transpired since then and what do we know or don't know today, and how have those three assumptions changed? Well, the first one, passage of the levy, as it was pointed out, that's a law because it did pass, so we can check that one off. That one came true. We made an assumption about the cap at 7.5, and we now know soon after December, they got into the budget discussions, we heard a wide, well, I should say a wide range of numbers. We heard 5, we heard plus 5.5. Then it ultimately ended up at 4. So that major assumption did not come true. It did not hold to be true. The last one, no wage increases beyond 17, only steps. As we know now, since we're in negotiations and assumptions that I have made, that didn't hold to be true. I've modified the assumptions in the forecast to reflect salary and wage increases and steps. Steps are already in there, but salary and wage increases through the entire forecast period. I made some assumptions out into the outer years. That's explained in the notes, but I made I won't see where is those. I won't comment on the magnitude of that assumption, but there is an assumption in the forecast about wage increases. We can talk about whether that should be there, it should not. You put yourself in two different types of situations that you can pick. The current situation that we're in is we didn't include any. So if you grant them, you have to fund them from somewhere. The flip side is you put something in, and when you get to that point, you can choose to grant that or not choose to grant that. Do more, do less, or do the same, but at least something's in there. If you choose to do something less, well, if you've behaved and planned along the way, then you're not unwinding something at that point. Just two different ways to look at it and two different situations that you'll put yourself into some 2 years down the road potentially. So those were the, unfortunately, I think the three major line items, the three major assumptions in any forecast: property tax revenues, state revenues, and personnel. We were batting 1 out of 3 in things coming true. Now, and unfortunately, what came out was less than what we expected or more in the case of expenditures. So that they did not work in our favor when it comes to cash balance projection. So here we are in,
I would
yes.
say that's an average that's better than the Indians. But wouldn't keep you on America's Got Talent,
Ouch, ouch, that's painful.
Wow, it is.
at least in playoffs.
Yeah. So here we are in December and we find out that our assumptions aren't met. So that is dashed. That was my little segue into what it looks like today. The blue line is where we were in December. The green line is where we are now in the forecast. And as you can see, those changes have resulted in, if you just look at 21 where we were, we had projected 0. It's now projected at about 90 million deficit. And then you have to take it out another year because in this forecast, we roll 17 back to be actuals. And now the 5 years of the forecast are 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. And you can see there, it projects out to about a $225 million shortfall. So let's take a look at the revenue and expense lines, how they've changed over time and what contributed to that change, because I think that's important to understand. How did those changes in those major assumptions contribute to this downturn in cash balance? This is the revenue and expense line back in December, the blue line being expenditures, green line being revenues. And as you can see, even in our planning back then, we were having a deficit of current revenues relative to current expenditures. In other words, we were eating away at the cash balance every year of that forecast. We modified the revenue numbers, as you can see here. Back in 17, when actuals came in, they were slightly up, but from FY18 and on out, we had to reduce that, and we'll go into the contributing factors to that as well. Then here recently, we adjusted the expenditure line. As you can see, it stayed fairly close with some increases in it, and then a projection out to 21. And I'll talk about the details of that here in a second. That leaves us with a completely different looking gap between expenditures and revenues than what we had back in December. That gap has widened. This is to give you a look at the annual contributions of revenue and expenditures to the change in cash balance. So when 17 came in as actual, you'll see that revenues came in at +5 over what we had forecasted. The expenditures came in at under 14 million, which contributed, as you recall, I said we had about a $20 million favorable cash swing. The math on this is fairly straightforward. Revenues minus expenditures gives you the change in cash balance. So in this case, +5 in revenues minus a -14 in expenditures gives you 19 positive. And that's the annual contribution each year. The takeaway from this graph, if you were looking for the one factor that was the biggest driver of the decline in cash balance, I think it's abundantly clear here. It's the change in the revenue assumption. So I accumulate those year to year, and you can see that by the time we get to 2021, there is a, just on the revenue side, on the revenue side, $91 million difference in cash balance accumulative to 21. But because the expenditures came in under 5 million, that nets out to 86 million change. So the change right here you can see is almost 100% due to a revenue decline. When we look at expenditures, the blue bars, did I miss something?
That's the detail. That's your revenue detail.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is revenue detail. So within each category, you can see property taxes. We have actually raised our estimate there. It came in 8 million above in actual numbers for 17, so we rolled that forward. So we've adjusted that up slightly. The other lines, the gray bars, and not much going on there in property tax allocation. That stayed, and we didn't adjust that forecast at all. Other revenues, those are transfers and advances. Now this this reduction in that estimate has to do with transfers and advances. You know, I said we were going to back that down in the forecast. So when you look at expenditures, you'll see a like decrease in expenditures in the non-operating expenditure category. So they offset one another, so it's kind of a net zero effect on cash balance. But you can see the big contributor here again is the orange bars. And the orange bar is state revenue. That's the difference between compounded 7.5% and 4%, which is what we're actually going to experience. On a cumulative basis, you'll see that they then come together and net to 91 million. But the state revenue, a change in assumption resulted in $127 million being taken out of the forecast. Does that make sense? These are the pieces and parts that net themselves to 91 million. When we look at expenditures, the major categories of personnel, non-personnel, and other, you'll see the personnel, we did come in favorable, so for 17, it was a favorable. I want to make sure I'm reading it right. 17s are the actual comparisons. Oh, and that's due to the 27 pay plan. Remember that? We missed the 27th pay, so it did come in over. Then for 18, 19, 20, and 21, that reflects the assumption about salary increases. And you might say, well, what's going on in 21? Why did that only go up by 6 million? And that's because in the original plan, we had to trend 21, and we just did it too high. Fortunate that we did, because now that we look at this, it was like it's already in the plan. So when we got the better estimates now, it's kind of worked itself out. So I think I pointed that out in one of our previous discussions, or like the May forecast, that we had to adjust that out in May. Non-personnel, in 17, you see it came under, but relatively unchanged, 17 through 21. And then in all other expenditures, they're down, but that's the offset to transfers and advances in revenue. On a cumulative basis, you can see that net, the changes in salaries and wages and benefits that are up by about 61 million are almost totally offset by my reductions in other categories. So once again, the takeaway is this an expense issue that caused that change in cash balance, or is it revenue? Well, I think it pretty much shows that it's revenue. This brings us to the current 5-year forecast, our picture of revenue and expenditures and cash balance. You see that the first 3 years to the left of the dotted line are the actuals, and then the 5 years of the projection. We always like to say when we're talking about a forecast that there's only 2 things about the forecast that I can tell you for sure. Number one, the data to the left of the dotted line, that won't change. Assuming Mike closed the books properly and he keeps everybody out of there, that won't change. But to the right, all I can tell you is that those lines probably aren't the way it's going to actually work itself out for a variety of reasons. And keeping that in mind, I had been discussing for some time and wanting to prepare a what-if scenario. Now, I affectionately called it my hurricane map. I was advised to call it something else. But if you get the idea of projections, and the farther
risk map.
the farther out you go, the wider that cone gets, and we don't know whether it's going to come to landfall in Miami or Savannah, but somewhere will be in that cone. So what we did, and we, I do mean collectively, we looked at our history of kind of over-under variances just to get a feel. Not terribly scientific, but we did look at the data and do some math in our head. And here's our October forecast as it stands right now. We said, well, let's do some plus and minus variances and see what kind of range we come up with. So the first one we did was we took what we would consider the worst of all worlds. Revenue comes in under and expenses come in above. We arbitrarily picked 1%, just so you could get a feel that 1% doesn't sound like a very large variance, but with a budget like ours, if revenues come in under, that's a negative variance by 1%, expenditures are negative as well by coming in over by 1%, you can see that that deficit moves almost $100 million. Well, after that settled, we digested that. We said, well, let's flip that. What if revenues come in above 1% and expenditures come in under? Because I've always said, in our month-to-month reports, we tend to be conservative. So that's what we like to see. Revenues come in above, expenditures come in under. If we do the flip of that, then you can see that it moves just about alike $100 million the other direction. To now it's projected to be $128 million. And while we felt good that it was moving in the right direction, we still realized that 128 million still is a significant deficit. But then it was really Eric's idea. He says, well, but let's look at what really kind of happens. And he was of the opinion that, and he gave me credit for it, he says, you're usually right on with revenues pretty good. Expenditures, you can't experience a variance. So we did something in between. We did revenues at spot on, 0% variance from the forecast, and expenditures as 1% under. And you get, obviously, something in between at about 174 million. So that's my map of, gosh, where might it come in? We're going to have a reaction. That would be 4 of you at this table, as well as the administration, will have to have some response at some time. relative to planning to address this, because clearly we can't continue to actually experience that deficit, so there'll be something that has to occur to change our revenue and or expense trend lines. But this gives you a better feel for kind of a probabilistic path that this could take. And that's just on the basis of our conservative forecasting and typical variances that might occur over time. This is kind of like before we do anything else, these are some of the changes that could just occur naturally. We felt this was a better picture. These three, we took the yellow line off because we thought we just don't have any experience of being off in that direction. So with that in mind, oh, thank you. Just as a reminder, our target's not zero. Our 30-day operating cash is $80 million. So even if we were looking at 128 million as the best scenario here, you're still 200 million short of your target. And we talked about the target when we did levy planning. We didn't include that. We planned to zero. We're all very cognizant of that. But it's just a reminder. So that's where we are today. Let me outline for you some very significant events that will be coming down the road that some we control, some we don't control. First, in calendar 2019 and 21, 19 we get a new governor, and in 19 and 21 we get two new state budgets that, quite frankly, I can make educated guesses, but I've been proven to be wrong on those.
And then
Everybody
will be
else.
House Speaker as well, come next General Assembly.
His name starts with House.
Oh, down.
Householder.
So, two big events that will impact both the funding formula potentially as well as changes to the cap. Could be in our favor, could be against us. Don't know, but they're looming out there. The budget in calendar year 19 will begin to affect fiscal years 20 and 21. The budget in 21 will affect fiscal year 22, and then fiscal 23, which isn't on our radar yet. Okay? Another item I'll point out is, I'm going to use the phrase typical school district levy planning time frame, or cycle as they refer to it. I put up here a 4-year cycle. We voted a levy in 16. 4 years could be 2020. I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't, that we will or won't. I'm just pointing out that as a significant event, we'll be 4 years down the road from our last operating levy, and there seems to be a pattern amongst a lot of school districts that that's a typical cycle. Can you find ones that go longer? Sure. Can you find ones that go shorter? Yes. So it's just, I hate to use the phrase benchmark, but it's just to give you an idea of where we are in that pattern or that cycle of levies. And last but certainly not least, sometime here in calendar 18, I would believe, we're going to have a new superintendent. Maybe he has some very novel and
Or she.
Or she.
oh, did I say? I practiced that. I apologize. I practiced it, and I blew it. I am so sorry. They may have some very innovative ideas or other approaches. We don't know, but when you change your
Printing money.
leadership, it's pretty significant. Huh?
Like printing money.
We could. We could do that. We have a great print shop. I don't know that we have those plates. So that's the picture of where we were, what some of the major assumptions changed. We have, I think it's about 38 pages of notes before you get to the actual 2-page forecast document. Again, my thanks to the 3 people to my right, Mike and Scott and Eric, for just putting another set of eyes and pointing out formulas that I might not have had right. We looked at the data and graphs and said, well, that doesn't look right, so we did a lot of inquiry there. We've pulled quite a bit of data, and I think with all of our eyes on it, have come up with a pretty good product, I believe. We like the layout and the format of the notes. Hopefully it answers and addresses most, if not all, the questions you might have, but that is the presentation. I'll do that version at the board meeting, maybe a little bit abbreviated, and I will practice on my pronouns.
And I'll add, you know, this is new, that our team took this in-house this year, not only saving the district money, but really being able to really focus in more. And, you know, I'm just really happy and thankful that I have you guys as a team. You guys done a fantastic job, and just really appreciate all your hard work on this. Thank you very, very much.
We actually had fun doing, believe it, I mean.
Yeah, fun.
Strange to say, my
Fun with
sound,
5-year forecast.
We,
Absolutely.
you know, numerous days, hours, meetings of going through it in my office and over and
So,
over.
and just briefly, this includes the CEA contract,
Yes,
and it includes these assumptions on the OPC contract.
that is correct.
But not all assumptions, because it's not finalized.
Well, that is correct. It includes everything that I'm privileged to, that I'm not
Correct.
privileged to share.
And let me
Yes.
just clarify that further. Those assumptions are built in for the 2 years and then carrying the numbers, same numbers beyond that?
No,
No.
no.
You've
We
made
all
some-
know that the
Okay.
CEA agreement was 1.5 and 1 for 18 and 19. I simply plugged in 1% for 20, 21, and 22. Somewhat on the Peretti model, but
Okay.
It's in the notes.
yeah, we put that in the notes, and I think we need to include something, because 2 years from now, you can decide to do something different.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
do year-end cash balances of FY '21 and '22, will those generate a letter from the State Department requesting a plan to address?
21 won't. It has to be within 2 years. So it'd have to be 20.
Okay,
So we should be okay on that front.
thank you.
So there is time, change of behaviors, and changing on some of the revenue assumptions that we know of today could drastically change. Please.
Now that, well, first, this is great, and I'll look forward to reading through it further. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I think when we did levy planning, we knew we had those issues. When we did the last forecast, when we knew the levy planning, we knew we were walking the razor's edge.
Mhm.
So I don't think, I mean, I think we go into this eyes wide open. We also know the labor market issues and some of the issues around that. So what do you suggest? I think, so we have time. We don't get the letter from Department of Education this year. It seems to me we need to be proactive in terms of kind of looking at our spend comprehensively and identify, because I don't think the state's gonna bail us out or come up with extra funds or decide they're not gonna fund community schools. And granted, you know, the ECOT going away could have some relief, but not significant. It's kind of a joke. I guess,
Kinda
and so,
funny.
with that, I guess with that, what would your recommendation be in terms of, or if not, you know, would it be possible for you and Scott to come back to us with a like a structure for, you know, the board to analyze, you know, what those spend items are, what are the items where we could work on savings, work on automation, you know, consider downsizing, identify as non-core functions, you know, in that way that, you know, as we round into the next year and begin to think about that letter and other things, that we will have already done some planning, bake that into the next budget, have the new superintendent begin to address some of those issues. Because I don't think they're short-term fixes, and I don't think the state, it's not gonna get better with the state. I just don't see them have any confidence that there would be, you know, there's an understanding
We're not
or
gonna see
appreciation.
10% again.
Yeah, and I also don't feel like our taxpayers in Columbus, our tax base is capable of continuing to absorb what we would otherwise need is higher taxes. You know, we have a lot of folks that don't have a lot of resources, so. And all that aside, what should we do to start that identification plan review?
Yeah, I think you just outlined it. You almost gave me the answer to your question.
It's a leading question then.
Yeah.
I just- like
Keeping, and I would agree with you, keeping in mind that sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Because, as an example, if you pull $10 million out of the 19 expenditure behavior that is ongoing, then that's really a $40 million contribution when you get 4 years out, because you take 10 out each year. So if you try and do a $40 million fix in the last year, that's a lot harder than a $10 million fix very early on. So sooner rather than later.
But we are looking into 19 for the most part, because 18
Yes.
is set.
18's pretty well cooked in the books at this point.
So it would be
And by
Why
the
no one
time you,
uses that verbiage?
yeah, oh, yeah, that's sorry. Baked in the
Baked
cake.
in.
Baked in
Yeah,
the cake.
yeah.
So
Yes.
you're right, you have to do that, because like I said earlier on, you have 3 ways to address the deficit. You increase your revenues, you decrease your expenditures, you do a combination of the two. And as the board talks about this, you have to make a decision about the increased revenue side of it, whether or not that's palatable, acceptable, advisable, approvable, whatever. But then, more importantly, then you end up looking at expenditures, and you're right, you have to look at putting everything on the table. I think Dr. Good had outlined for you some areas that could be under consideration at some point in time. But as you read the forecast, look at those pie charts and look at the big blue areas. And it's the big blue areas where that's where you go when you go to make expenditure reductions. You don't look at the fuel line. It's not enough money. So you have to, we thought maybe, I almost thought about coming up with a donut chart for you. And that old saying, keep your eye on the donut and not the hole. Well, the donut part is state revenue, property taxes, and personnel. Everything else is in this hole. And so for us to have the kind of impact we need, we have to address it, looking at those major categories. And how much of that do we control? How much of it can we adjust? But you're right, sooner is better than later, and it certainly will be a challenge for the next superintendent. And I would imagine tops on their list depending upon when they arrive on the scene.
I think that, I mean, I agree fully with all of that, but I think we really need to address it, at least to the extent we're able to, on Tuesday, when this is presented, and to be able to say that we recognize those realities and we're starting now, or we've already started looking at those things, finding where we can make those kinds of cuts and savings. And I think it needs to be part of the same message.
I'll let
this coming Tuesday.
Dr. Stanford deliver that part of it.
Well, I guess the one thing I would just add is that I think it would be very helpful in terms of the administration having those discussions, if the board were to give us some guidance about what are some of the priorities when we look at the operations of the school district, in terms of classroom, in terms of business and operation items that we have already, started to invest in and started to, expend on. So that would be helpful, I think, for the administration to understand what are some of those things that are top priorities for the board in that conversation.
And I would, I mean, for me, I would be happy to engage with that. And I think, I'm wondering if maybe that FAC, if we could work with, work on it and to come up with a menu to provide to the board, so this body wouldn't make any decisions in any way, but to come up with a menu, because it, I mean, we don't, most of what we review isn't itemized. I mean, it is, but we don't really delve there. So I would not feel comfortable making recommendations or, and I think all of us have different views and understandings about how things, I'm not in the trenches, I'm not on the ground with all this. But I think, it's, for me, it's, identifying what's sort of core function. When I say that, it's like, you start at classroom and then, where do you go out from there? And there's so many critical functions then also because of all of the other challenges our students have, then, that might not be classroom, but it's still critical. And then, but I think that it's like, how do we figure out what we're shouldering all by ourselves that maybe we need other folks to shoulder, and where do we have either, I mean, some of it's, what do we have assets we can liquidate? What do we have programs we spin out and, maybe partner but we don't manage? And that, but then, and like everyone else is dealing with what should be automated, and begin to look at that. But I think we've got to be aggressive with that and tell the community as well, we're being aggressive with this now because we know that we're trying to do the responsible thing, but also, our revenue from the state is a moving target and they aren't prioritizing us.
And some of those things, the state requires us to do as well.
The mandated.
The mandated items, yeah. And so like the investments we have made in special education, right?
Right.
Were mandates by the state. And so, those investments, we're not going to want to
keep, correct.
But that's where then too, we maybe via board and talking about this, that's for the public policy team to be able to
Yep.
go to legislators and other community leaders to say, look, we can't do all of this with the meager resources that are provided.
has to be a multi-pronged approach, absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I think the last time the board talked about this, we said a few things that we wanted to see vis-a-vis recommendations from the administration. We wanted to make sure we kept all levy promises that we made. That was critically important to us. We wanted to limit impact on the classroom. And I think we said if we had our preference, we would stay off the ballot until 2020. Those are the three of the main tenets that we discussed. And so other than that, I think everything else has got to be on the table. I think there are no sacred cows. I think also part of that is talking about funding irregularities and inequities. And so not only talking again about the charter school funding and how our deduct affects us more than it should based upon how charter schools are funded, but then also revisiting the whole cap issue. And, is it time to, it's been 20 years since DeRolf, is it time to have those, it's been a long time, and we still haven't seen a fix, so is it time to start having those discussions again? I mean, what could we do with $83 million a year? What could we do with the millions of dollars that we don't get because the way charter schools are funded and how it impacts our deduct? And so I think we need to be talking about all of those things. It would be irresponsible not to. The way the state funds education, as we all know, is unconstitutional, and it doesn't work. And the fact that the state continues to insist that the responsibility is pushed down to the local level, it's not going to work. And as Board Member Hudson said, folks are tapped out, and we go back every 4 years. But if we had that $83 million, for example, we wouldn't have to go back every 4 years. We wouldn't have to go back very often at all, if ever. And so, there are other bigger public policy issues. $1 billion worth of tax cuts to businesses in a year. Some folks would say that poked a hole. Did we get an ROI on that is anywhere close to what we now are seeing taking $1 billion away from education? The cost-benefit analysis on some of those things. So I think it's a big discussion. It's a really big discussion. I think we need to talk about all of those things, Mr. Chairman.
I agree.
And I agree, we have to do that. But we need to start that conversation and talk about
On Tuesday.
doing that on Tuesday. And I think, the 3 points that you made about the things that the board set out, I think we need to mention those again on Tuesday, including our desire not to have to go back for new money until 20. But I think communicating perhaps subtly that our situation might compel us to do something sooner.
Mr. Chairman, I think we need to at least talk about that. I think everything has to be on the table.
Well, let's make sure that when we do get the forecast, I think you did do a good job explaining some of the state situations. Any way that we could really hammer that home clear so that the listening audience is seeing this is the reality that we're dealing with on the revenue side would be very helpful. School funding is complicated. Most people are busy raising kids, paying bills, and do not pay attention to school funding. We're just the bearer of bad news and the messenger in this issue sometimes. So, the more that we can do to really make that case clear, what the drivers are that have put us in this situation, so that folks can understand. And if we will have to be the ones that make those comments about what the board would like to see, the things that we want to keep safe. That is something that the treasurer usually does not sort of delve into. So when we do go through the presentation, we should discuss how we will be discussing that at the board table, how we want to start having this conversation now, what we want to protect, and what we would like to see going into the future.
Well, and I know Stan and Scott and Mike can attest to this, and whenever you've had to do this type of process in the school district in the past, it's always an iterative process where you're getting information, then you make some decisions, and then you make some more, you get some more information, and then make more decisions. And so it's a process of getting information and then being able to go through that information and make decisions from that.
Well,
That-
feeling pretty good. Do we have any other more comments?
We have a handle on the situation at hand, and I think we have a handle on what we need to begin to do sooner rather than later. And I recognize, I think we all do, that it's a difficult decision because it's easier, I'll use the phrase more fun, to build an organization than to perhaps take away from an organization. I had a board member years ago say to me that no organization ever cut itself to greatness. And I think over the last 4 years, we've done a lot to enhance program, delivery of service to students. And I think there's a lot of data, statistics, metrics that bear out that there is a return on that investment. And unfortunately now, everything is on the table. And we'll have to identify those things that we believe have less of a return. It's just what we've all said, we know that. So we'll mention that. I appreciate your comment that there are some topics that I'm not really the one to mention it, so I'm sure board members, you have never had any reservation about speaking up, so I trust that will be well taken care of Tuesday night.
Well, but I also think we should look at it as, not trying to stop the progress through cuts, but also, technology is unlike it's ever been before. There are lots of resources and ways folks think about doing things, collaborating, coordinating like never before. And so I think that we should look for those opportunities as well. I'm not saying it won't be hard, or we might, but we won't be able to do things the same way I think it's like automating checks. Automate the checks, get the checks automated. Let's get that's cheaper. We need to have that mentality again of not turning over every rock, but that's a rock, and let's turn over all the rocks. What do we know of right now, and what are other districts doing, and but I think President Baker, I certainly agree, no sacred cows. Not to suggest anyone's a cow.
Thank you.
Well, and I look back when this committee started, that, we were following the previous mayor's initiative that had a lot of corporate involvement. I can't even think of, the exact title, but, at the time when people were so worried about the schools, all these industry, got involved and wanted to sort of like tell us where to go, and it didn't happen. But now to say it's basically the taxpayers and then the state taxpayers that are funding everything, and so maybe, part of this is to see what can our corporate partners do to help us with automation or further, or, at least not taking the TIFs that are diverting income, basically. So it's almost like we're being punished that we've done so well and it's like not on fire anymore. So now everybody's like, oh, well, they'll figure it out. So I guess I'm saying, maybe we can look at what are the benefits that our corporate, because these are people that are going to be hiring the students that we're educating. So they also have something to say that they don't want to see that trend line going in the basement. So I'll just say, that's a long way of saying, we've done good, but we also need to, we still want those people to be involved in the community and
Absolutely, and they're going to be really, they're going to be examples of, yes, it's very good to explore. I don't want to put us in a position where we are going to, I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of things that are going to be hard, based on a big part of what we do. Most of it's teachers and staff. So are we talking about, outsourcing, the public service to another entity? I don't know. I mean, there could be good and bad things. I think we do have to explore everything though. But I don't want us to get too excited that we're going to have an entity run to save us.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying have a voice.
Absolutely, though.
Well, and I think most important is that we need to use our data that we have available to us to see what's
Absolutely.
working and what's not working, where are we getting that return on investment,
Yeah.
and use that as a driving force as well.
Absolutely.
You've touched on some pretty high-level policy issues, and then we're talking about maybe sacred cows are more operational. And I sort of look at this as that, when we try and manage economic policy in the nation, you have fiscal policy and you have monetary policy. And fiscal policy, those big high-level issues, are much slower than monetary policy, where the Fed changes an interest rate. And so we face those kinds of decisions too. We can have a long talk about, hey, problem goes away if the cap goes away. I highly doubt that's going to go away in the next 2 years. But we can have that discussion. So I'm looking at it in terms of that way, that we can have these fiscal some fiscal policy types of discussions. But when the end of the day comes, your administration is going to be charged with that monetary policy. What are we going to do to tweak the dollars and cents, and however that is? So it's a great discussion. I mean, you should probably have that all the time, because this is as you know, we live and are pretty close to managing by the forecast, which is good. Month to month, we see it in the forecast format. We do the forecast in the and we always think long term about what are the impacts, and are these programs that we put in place sustainable? Is that revenue an ongoing source of revenue? So it's great. Tonight we'll do this, and it's just the beginning. It's not really the beginning of the process. It's a continuation of a process, because keep in mind that back in the spring, after Scott went through all this budget process, and they redid it again and reduced it when we heard that it wasn't going to be 5 or 5.5, we began to react to that. So we've already begun budgetarily to react to it somewhat. So we weren't waiting for the forecast to come out and for FAC to say, hey, you guys need to do something about this. Administration knew that process is underway. Those conversations are being had.
Any more questions on 5-year forecast?
Just a little, help me understand, you've got the 5 years you've got the levy that was for 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
4. So are there other levies that come up in this
They're all
period?
continuing.
They're all continuing,
continuing.
except for this one that we're talking
Well,
about.
no, this one is continuing. The levy cycle is the concept that that levies, you get a stair step.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that revenue stays fairly flat. So if you look at a graph of our property tax revenues, it's somewhat upward sloping, but it's fairly flat. Unfortunately, that's not the slope of the line of your expenditures, and
Yeah.
they inevitably crisscross. So the life is really relative to that cash balance. And typically, that cash balance will spike and then run itself off
Right.
after 4 years or so.
No, I get that. I just
Okay.
wasn't sure. I didn't
Oh, no,
understand.
no, no, they're all
Your
continuing.
periods, you have all continuing levies.
They're all continuing
Okay,
levies.
that's what I care about.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, well, before we adjourn, next month,
I have a question.
yeah, please.
So when are we gonna talk about the capital?
That's what I was just gonna bring up after we're done with
Oh, I was thinking we were gonna talk about it
the
today.
facilities operating piece.
Yes.
So the
Well-
facilities operating budget, I talked to Mr. Oldham, who may still be here.
He is.
And, you know, due to what we had been dealing with the last few months and wanted to make sure we focused in on this, we are looking at possibly November or December, possibly of that. I know we got to double check. I'd like to have a meeting internally to kind of go over that and make sure it makes sense, and how the presentation looks, that it's got enough data in it, it's not misleading or confusing people. So I would like to see it within the next 2 months. We also have the City of Columbus
Right.
coming in next month to go over their tax abatement policy. And I think that's good. I mean, I'll be honest with you. A lot of the conversations that you hear about tax abatements are a little overblown on what it is. You can't pay bills with money you don't have. So if you are developing, sometimes we have a say in it, sometimes we don't have a say in it. Sometimes people will not develop, or they will develop. We heard a lot of it when we were talking about the Pizzuti Rickenbacker deal, and quite frankly, the warehouse would not have been built, or it would have gone to another political subdivision on the south side that would have given them the 15% 100 or 15-year 100% abatement. I mean, Groveport Madison would have taken it, Obetz, any of those would have taken it. We were able to leverage a lot of extra resources, $1.1 million in fixed dollars, 10 internships for 10 years, so in 10 internships every year, $160,000 in career tech, and 5 reading kiosks that usually have an annual upkeep of around 80-ish thousand, I think, or that's the cost.
You read my memo.
What's that?
You read my memo.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, it's a really good conversation to have. Now, they will sort of discuss things like, some of the from what I know of what the city has talked about, is that, yes, in the short north, it's a different situation. It's not that they don't need them anymore. It's just evolved over the years in the different areas. Developers take abatements, use them so that they can turn a profit. So my quick footnotes is you're not going to see in the west side or the south side an investment by a developer to build a nice residential tower, because it's capitalism. There's no return on that investment, and that's why that they exist. But it's a really good presentation. They talk about a lot of other things that the city could do a lot better, and that is, what do you do with your existing neighborhoods? What can we do to keep homeowners in their neighborhoods, like in Wineland Park, as they develop that, how they've been able to keep people there, but develop at the same time. So kind of that's beyond some of those conversations, dealing with the sort of tax incentives. That gets into some more other functions that the city is doing currently do better. But it was I went to one of their meetings, and Steve Shumey did a really fantastic job, and that's why I want to bring them here, because it's a really good conversation to have, and not to say that it's always one of those areas where, I just think it's one of those areas that also has a lot of myths involved in it as well. And we really, this team right here, and Eric already left, did a fantastic job really representing the school district in the short and long term, because eventually those abatements do roll off, and there will be more revenues coming in once they do fall off. But we were also making sure that we were also taking care of in the short term. But I guess my biggest point about this whole thing is you really can't pay bills with money you don't have. And it doesn't exist. No one's losing anything. They're only losing it if the argument was made and proved that a development would happen without the incentive. And I think more or less, the economics usually point to, no, this isn't gonna happen unless there's some sort of incentive that the developer, whomever, can make a profit, you know? Yeah, please.
And on a related note,
Uh-huh.
I watched video of you speaking at the West High meeting, and that
Oh.
was very, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Explaining like preservation credits don't help you if you're not a tax-paying entity, so.
Yeah, so
yeah,
like that
so
was.
you
they-
are on social media.
Oh, great.
explaining that. Yeah, it was very good.
I have a lot of fans now, I've noticed.
Yes, it was excellent.
Good.
so-
Be prepared for it to go viral.
They're not always good fans. But yes, that will
Thank
happening.
you. Well, I'm just anxious to see that and looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to
That sounds like a good presentation as well.
And the facilities operating budget, I would like to see that, you know, as a board, you know, we've discussed, and this is kind of getting out of finance committee a little bit, but, you know, we've discussed, you know, core functions of the board moving forward. I've always believed in facilities being a standalone committee that continues. This could be a facilities operating budget, could be a tool that flows into that for the future, and NSDP being the back end of it as you design the things that are happening, but that we have a facilities committee that will use this tool that we're developing right now through this facilities operating budget that'll help us out in the future, and something that we'll constantly be looking at and using, kind of like this committee is, just for, you know, the operating dollars. Cool. Anything else?
I'm good.
Move to adjourn, oh.
No, I believe we have to approve this of some sort, right? We have to
No.
approve this to send it up to the board?
Well, we would
Yeah.
We
just
make a
recommend
recommendation,
it.
that's what I
So
mean.
let's,
Motion to recommend the board receive this forecast.
That was really good parliamentary procedure, and
How about
I
that?
second that.
But you should have another member, the chair should.
Oh.
I will second for you since I brought this
All
up.
right.
Okay.
All those in
Thank you.
favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. All right.
I didn't want you to get away
No,
without
no,
having
no.
that.
That's
Get done.
very good.
And then do we have another motion?
Motion to adjourn?
Does that help?
Oh,
Second things?
I will second it.
All right. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, folks, get out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being flexible.